I think most of you, all of you probably know who Crystal Leonetti is. She is Yupik, and she was double booked today. And I forget actually where she's from. Leona, do you remember?
Where Crystal's from? I think,
Yeah.
perhaps Dillingham. I wish I
Yeah.
feel like I should know this. And her sister lives in Homer.
Anchor Point.
What's that, Diane?
Her family's in Anchor Point.
Anchor
Oh,
Point.
yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for the
Diane.
clarification.
And then I'm Danielle Stickman. I am Dina'in and Koyukon Athabaskan. I grew up in Nundalton, which is in Bristol Bay. My mother is Karen Evanoff from Nundalton. My father is Danny Stickman from Galena. And then next is James Tempty.
Yeah, good afternoon. My name is James Tempty. I'm a member of the Northern Cheyenne tribe, originally from Wyoming. I lived in Alaska for the past 10 years in Anchorage, worked with tribes and tribal organizations for the past 15 years, and have been at Alaska Pacific University going on 3 years now. So yeah, excited to teach this course and look at different ways of inclusion and equity. And so, yeah, we'll learn more about that, but yeah, thanks for being here. And I'll pass it on to Casey.
And that's just a real quick introduction in my Chupik language. My Chupik name is Kuli Yulinguk. My name's Casey Ferguson. I grew up in Chivak. Before I moved here to Anchorage, I grew up out there for 18 years. And my focus has always been working with our Indigenous people. I've taught, coached Native games, our culture. I've
Casey?
in the systems field. Yeah.
Your sound is breaking up pretty badly. I don't know if you're able to go off your headset. If your computer will pick up.
Fortunately.
Yeah, it's pretty. We can't hear you, sadly.
Oh no. Oh no. Let me work on that real quick.
It's a little bit better.
Is that better?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, that's better. All right.
Yeah.
So, where was I? I grew up in Chivak my whole life before I moved here to Anchorage. My focus has always been working with our Indigenous folks. I've worked with elementary students and high school students in teaching Native games and teaching our culture. And for a small stint, I did work in the subsistence field, teaching our Indigenous youth the ins and outs of our subsistence culture. So yeah, that's me.
Thanks. And I'm going last. My name is Liana Hefner, and I am based here in Anchorage. I'm the partnership director for the Northwest Boreal Partnership, which is part of the NLP, and I'm also a staff member at Alaska Conservation Foundation. And I used to work at Fish and Wildlife Service for the Western Alaska Partnership back in the day. I'm originally from Santa Fe, New Mexico. And so I grew up in what's often called Indian country, but actually was very much isolated from Indigenous people. Just had a lot of very eye-opening experiences once I moved to Alaska and started working with Alaska Native communities and Canadian First Nations. So I'm very, very, very honored to be part of this team working on this project. It's been inspiring and fun, and I'm really, really excited for the fall when we get to have these conversations together as a group with all of the participants.
Awesome. And then throughout the course, we will also have guest speakers from members of the tribal community, elders, youth, and agency staff. So next slide.
So you're probably thinking, what is the Indigenizing Land Management, Stewardship, and Conservation course? So we have got together and we've talked about this a bit. And so we wanted to design a course that could help agency professionals, Fish and Wildlife Service employees, to learn how to create a more welcoming, respectful space that includes dialogues and productive collaborations with Indigenous people and Indigenous communities on issues surrounding the land and conservation that we all interact with. So following the service's current approach to its Alaska Native Relations training program, this course, it'll be team taught, drawing on experts from Indigenous communities, elders and emerging youth leaders who are leading dialogues in Indigenous values, priorities, and racial equity, and professionals who work closely with tribes and Indigenous organizations on science and conservation challenges. So this course is, you initially will get CEUs for it, but you'll be able to work with folks at other agencies, for tribal organizations, and also students here at APU.
So the way that we have put this together and what the objectives are is, this is, as the course title suggests, this is all in the context of land management, conservation, and land stewardship. So within that context, we wanted to have a space to learn together and to have dialogue together around what have been the impacts of colonization on Indigenous communities around management and conservation, and how can we, from having that understanding, grow a greater awareness around our, cultural understanding of that history, but also where we are currently and where we want to go in the future. So, we want to have conversations around how do we provide essentially tools for dismantling some of these, systemic inequities that we see. Part of this is having some difficult conversations, but also some really inspiring ones too. So we're going to be bringing in guest speakers, and there's a lot of really cool stories to share, around all of these Indigenous-led efforts in Alaska and in other regions where there's when we use the term indigenizing, we're talking about really reviving and bringing in Indigenous approaches to conservation and land management. And that can be both, traditional approaches, but also bringing in, a lot of modern approaches and science and how that can all work. So there's a lot of cool stories to share. In addition to having some of these more difficult conversations that are important but necessary. And we just want to have this, we decided early on that we want the course to be a place where it's a space where we can be open and build relationships and build trust. That's a really core tenet of one of the objectives of this course. So that we're all coming together. You've got agency professionals such as yourself coming together alongside other students, Indigenous elders, and also youth to have these conversations and build these relationships and come up with ideas of how to better collaborate now and in the future. So the way that we've structured it, and we'll see a full outline of the course in a moment. It's going to be an 11-week course where we meet once a week for 2 hours, and it'll be this hybrid approach. So for those of you who are in Anchorage, you have the option to come to APU campus. We'll also have Zoom set up so that anyone can join from Zoom. But we did plan, we want to have some time to come together in person, both at the beginning and the end of the course. I think Danielle, you're up.
Thank you. All right, so as with any course and kind of with any workshop, we want to have the option for agreements, or not have the option, but integrate agreements of how we will relate and connect with each other. So we'll be using examples from the First Alaskan Institute agreement. These are their agreements for the racial equity dialogues on their website. I think this is just a great set of agreements that many other people have used. And so we'll be offering these agreements at the beginning of the course, but also ask the participants to create their own and what feels right for them in the course. And so a lot of these may stay or they may shift and change according to the class.
So here is our draft schedule. So week 1, have an in-person gathering. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then weeks 2 through 4, talk about the history of land ownership and management, both from Western and Indigenous perspectives, conservation heroism, and then also decolonization and indigenation. Weeks 5 and 6 look at equity and inclusion, just go through some definitions, exercises, have some dialogues, example of good policies, what does equity look like? And so that I think is really interesting, especially because it's not only equity in having a place at the table, but equity when it comes to divvying up resources. And then weeks 7 and 8, talk a little bit about Indigenous stewardship, reframing conservation and reframing land and wildlife management. And then week 9, Indigenous collaborations and community engagement. I really love this piece because I think that's where a lot of really meaningful relationships can be built. Then week 10, we'll take it off. And week 11, talk about Indigenous collaborations, methods for unlearning and learning and sharing power. And then week 12, we'll have our final kind of course wrap up, and part of the course will, the work will be putting together a presentation. And so we'll look at and participate in all the presentations. And so that's kind of what our schedule is looking like right now.
And are there any questions up to this point? Oh, I see one from Gilbert. Will the focus be on theory, practice, or both?
It'll be on both. And I think that's really important because I think a lot of this is really just currently it's the content's emerging and growing and evolving. And so the theories may not be written yet, but I think we have a lot of good examples on directions where this type of work is headed.
Thanks, James. Yeah, and if there are other questions as we go along, you can throw them in the chat or use the raise hand function or just chime in verbally. Awesome. Okay.
Next slide. So the in-person gathering, why an in-person gathering to kick it off? And I think Leanna touched on it, is we really want to kind of get to know one another and then also build trust within the class and just create a safe space to have these discussions. Some of them are going to be really informational, but some of them could be tied to a lot of passion and emotion and really looking at things from a different perspective. So with that, during the first introduction in person, we wanted to include definitely some cultural components, but then also some inspirational material. So I know we've recently watched some films on conservation and the success of collaborative conservation. So that'll be a piece of it. And then also just a time to kind of network with one another, whether it's through a scavenger hunt or a bonfire. So that's kind of what the first in-person gathering will look like.
Thanks, James. So Crystal Leonetti has been the person shepherding this portion along, and since she couldn't make it today, I offered to just speak on her behalf to provide some information about this section. So we'll start off the course after that in-person gathering, then we'll switch to our just 2 hours a day on Fridays. I can't remember if we mentioned the time, but it will be 10 a.m. to noon on Fridays. So these are those first 3 weeks when we're getting started in those 2-hour Fridays. So first class, we're going to talk about the history of land management and conservation from, how things have come from a Western perspective. So we'll touch on, I know everyone's familiar with ANILCA, but, some of these really, landmark policies and laws that were put in place, and, have a conversation together about, what are the Western approaches and the Western perspectives that have really influenced, the history of land management and where we are today. And we also wanted to get into a bit of the, conservation. And so really who has framed sort of what we think of modern day conservation often from that Western perspective, and get into what is conservation heroism. And then the next class, we're going to then switch over to talking about Indigenous perspectives on land management and stewardship. And again, in that historical context. And so talking about, the history of different names and places, and how, lands have been claimed and managed by Westerners, but told from an Indigenous perspective. And sort of, getting into certain aspects of Indigenous stewardship and land management. For example, how Indigenous place names really tie into those Indigenous values. And then when in the third class, we're going to get more into colonization and decolonizing. And so what were the impacts of colonization on Indigenous communities? Getting into what is decolonization and what does it mean, particularly in this context of land management, and then on the flip side, what is indigenizing land management? So again, we'll have some speakers, but also space and time for dialogue on all of these.
And then the next few weeks, we'll be discussing equity and inclusion, and really looking at what does equity and inclusion look like individually asking the students, what does that look like to them, both in the environmental field in which they hope to work in or they currently are working in, and also how does it feel in the body, and how does it feel in the workplace when there is equity and inclusion. And also giving them homework assignments to research policies that execute equity and inclusion well. So what organizations or agencies are really doing, really executing equity and inclusion well, and what does that look like? And then also researching policies that may not do it as well, and provide reasons why or why not either the policies are doing a wonderful job and why they may not be. And then also researching specific to Alaskan organizations that have equity and inclusion policies as part of their website or in their employee handbook, or and just really looking at ones that really connect with the students. So, and along with asking a lot of other questions, we'll be doing exercises and listening to podcasts and really exploring this idea of, does increasing diversity equal equity and inclusion? Because there's been a lot of push to increase diversity, but does that actually mean that means equity and inclusion? And asking the question, why do we do a land acknowledgement, and really what is behind a land acknowledgement, looking at implicit bias, and also finding a place in moving forward. And hopefully that place will be deepening our understanding, our collective understanding, our individual understanding, and creating more empathy, and with all that, growing in partnerships and collaborations. And so there are quite a few things that we'll be going into in this portion, but these are just a few materials that will be in the homework assignments. That's Martin Luther King's Three Evils of Society, and then there's an essay on the three seeds. So I think it will be great, and that's coming off of all the material that had been shared in the land management portion.
For this section of the course, we'd be getting into reframing conservation and land and wildlife management and incorporating traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, and those methods of conservation and management. We'll get into things like traditional fire burns to maintain the land and how that prevents wildfires. There was a really good film that we watched that touched on that, and then getting into some of the traditional methods of subsisting, fishing, hunting, and all that really good stuff. That's the kind of stuff that I get really excited about. But understanding land and waters and how the people were connected and understood everything about the land. I'll get into this picture really quick. So this is Chivak. This is my hometown, and Chivak that translates to man-made channel, and you can see that first river bend, that first sharp river bend there. That never used to exist. You see the two little sloughs off to the side of it. That was the main channel. But somewhere in I think it was in the 1940s, some of the men went over there, and they knew that if they had dug a little canal there, eventually the current would turn that into a river, and they'd have a shortcut to get to where they needed to go, because back then they used kayaks and paddled their boats to get from place to place. So they understood that if they used the current to their advantage, they'd cut their trips a little shorter. So incorporating those aspects along with traditional names and applying TEK to protect and limit land use and resources.
Just to chime in on that, one thing that we're excited to also share is there's a lot of cool examples from the lower 48 and also Canada, where Canada, there are a lot of Indigenous, First Nations and others in the Métis and Inuit communities that have been working really well with government agencies to move towards co-management, to move towards Indigenous led conservation and land management. So there's some really cool stories that we hope to share within Alaska, within the lower 48, and also here across the border in Canada.
So then we'll have a session on Indigenous collaboration and community engagement. While crucial, co-creation can be challenging to implement. I think we've all kind of experienced, the setbacks and also successes at some points, but the process really requires forethought and reflection, just about like the cognitive basis, sociocultural norms, political and economic structures that can either aid or impede the establishment of equitable partnerships. And so we'll go over some methods on how to effectively engage with communities. And so just from the beginnings of having community members be involved in setting goals for different projects, building personal and professional relationships and different methods to do that, and then relationships across communities as their needs and the Indigenous knowledge may be different. And then prioritize the contributions of Indigenous knowledge to the projects in equitable and meaningful ways. And so we'll have a lot of different examples on how this is done and how to host a community meeting where people actually show up, and how we can do more than, just emails and letters. And so I think that is when you can really get a lot of success out of these efforts, and really build partnerships. So yeah, I'm excited about that piece.
And this is Beth. I'm really excited to work with this team here. So methods for learning and unlearning and sharing power. You know, the question has come actually from classes that I've taught over the years on Indigenous knowledges and the sciences. And students have, you know, looked critically at a variety of sources, examined their own education in science in terms of what they were taught. And you know, how some of this might intersect with Indigenous knowledge or perhaps diverge away from the kinds of beliefs and values that Indigenous peoples have. And so, you know, specifically with this course, we have an exchange with Maori students in New Zealand. And so, you know, their recognition, I think, of Maori Ramatanga or Maori knowledge, you know, has gotten, I think, a bit more traction, perhaps in North America. But they're, you know, one of their critical questions is, you know, what kinds of perspectives, values, norms, and practices need to be unlearned in order to engage Indigenous knowledges and collaborative initiatives. And then also looking at ways of sharing power in terms of co-production of knowledge. So these are these quotes and the question are actually, you know, have come from courses that I've taught before. And I see it as kind of a wrap up, I guess, of the different topic areas that the other co-instructors are covering, you know, so kind of reflecting back on the course, thinking about, you know, the kinds of ways in which we've learned science and what sorts of things might we need to set aside in order to authentically collaborate with Indigenous communities. So I don't have the environmental sciences background that the other team members do. But in thinking about my own science education, you know, I was taught things like, you know, humans are the only species to have language and use tools. Of course, we know that's not true now. I was taught that nature exists in a state of competition. Of course, we know there's a lot of collaboration that goes on. So these are the kinds of things that we'll talk about during this wrap-up piece and have some exercises around. I think James is a lot more organized than I am at this point, but this is sort of a starting point for me. So thank you.
I'm sure you're all really wanting to know how to register. So you can register by sending me an email and we'll put you on a list. And then about 6 weeks prior to the course, our registration office will be sending out a link for how to register online.
You're on mute again. Oh, James, you're on mute again.
Sorry. So yeah, to register, just email me. It's $110, which covers the APU's fee for transcripting the CEUs. So if you're interested in CEUs, we're going to cap the course at 30 participants, but we've reserved 8 spots for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And so, yeah, we'll be in touch with folks probably about 6 weeks prior to the course with online registration instructions. But if you want to get your name on a list to ensure that you have a spot, just email me. And yes, we will have CEUs, continuing education credits. And this course will get 3 CEUs. And then in the future, next year when we offer it, we'll actually be offering it for college credit as well.